LBC Road one night, a young man loses his life. They mark the shoulder with a cross, and his family gathers round on a piece of hallowed ground. Their hearts are heavy with their loss. As the tears fall from their eyes, there's one who always sympathizes. God only cries for the living, 'cause it's the living that are left to carry on. And all the angels up in heaven, they're not grieving because they're gone. There's a smile on their faces, 'cause they're in a better place than they've ever known. God only cries for the living, 'cause it's the living that are so far from home. It still makes me sad when I think of my own dad. I miss him each and every day, but I know the time will come when with my only son, he'll wonder why I went away. Maybe we're not meant to understand till we meet up in the promised land. God only cries for the living, 'cause it's the living that are left to carry on. And all the angels up in heaven, they're not grieving because they're gone. There's a smile on their faces, 'cause they're in a better place than they've ever known. God only cries for the living, 'cause it's the living that are so far from home. Yeah, we're so far from home. Many years ago, Gary was up there skiing at North Fork, and Donna was pulling him in the boat. And when you fall backwards, it's not too bad when you ski, but when you fall forward, it's a little more involved. And Gary fell. Donna looked around. Back then, we didn't have life jackets. You had the little ski belt. The ski belt popped up. No Gary. Then later on, Gary popped up over here. You remember that, Gary? Knocked you right out of your belt. And the reason why that caught my attention was because to tell the story, it's just hard to believe. But I remember as Donald just looked back and he's driving that little old boat, and all of a sudden that belt just pops up. But when Gary wasn't in it, he turned that boat on a dime, and it wasn't a very big boat, but that's a boat I remember, and whipped around to go get him. You can always tell stories in the past where there was someone to verify what you said. In other words, it's called a witness. Now, what we've been doing the last 3 weeks, and we're going to conclude it today, we're trying to find some scripture that gives us words of encouragement. Now, I call your attention to chapter 12 of the book of Hebrews, verse 1. It's going to be behind me. I want you to notice what this says, because it's actually the very last verse of scripture that we're going to read when we close out later on. And it says, "Wherefore, seeing we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses." Now, what Paul had just got through doing was going over in his mind individuals that he had heard about, that he had read about in Old Testament times. And he names many of them in chapter 11. As a matter of fact, I want you to go back and I want you to look at that chapter, if you will. I mean, let me just name a couple of them quickly. You know, we could talk about the faith of Abraham. We could talk about the faith of Moses. We could talk about the faith of David. We could talk about the faith of these Old Testament patriarchs and really be encouraged by them, because they were people just like you and I were. And it seemed like that even though when they failed and they recovered, they always came through. And that encourages us. In verse 33 of that chapter, notice what he says. "Who through faith they subdued kingdoms, they wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, and of weaknesses were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to fight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again." And then all of a sudden, if he would have just stopped right there, we would have ended this story by saying, yeah, but that doesn't happen to everybody. And he went on, and he began to talk about these witnesses that he read after, that maybe he even personally knew of some, I don't have a clue, but there were witnesses that he began to describe who were victorious. And then there were some, he says, and notice how it says, and others. Notice how he put it. He mentions Abraham. He mentions Moses. He mentions David. He mentions Jacob. He mentions Joseph and others. Well, is he degrading those others? No, notice why he says it. "And others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and of scourgings, yes, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were cut half in two, they were tempted, they were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented. Of whom," remember the others, "of whom the world is not worthy." Do you see where he put those folks? These are the witnesses that he mentions there in verse number 1, that we are surrounded by. If we would just stop and remember this morning. Let me keep going. "Of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect." Let me explain those last two verses. Ever since Genesis 3:15, when God first promised the Messiah, God's people in the Old Testament times looked for the coming of the Messiah, because God promised that, and yet they didn't live to see it. And Paul talks about these Christians that he's writing to, these Hebrews, these Jews that have been saved. He talks about how that they many of them had witnessed the very Jesus Christ himself. And they had received personally that promise. But those that went on, without them, we wouldn't be complete. Without them, the family would not be complete. We need them. Now, what do we need them for? Are you not encouraged by finding an individual like King David who committed terrible sins to recover from that and still search after the very heart of God? Or what about Solomon that went off the deep end because of his pagan wives and yet turned right around and decided to build a great and elaborate temple to God and understood what wisdom was all about? Or Moses that rejected the will of God and for 40 years was out in the wilderness and God called him at 80 years old. These are words of encouragement. Wait a minute, but I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about something that you and I can personally identify with. So you do what I've already done. Let's walk us through the story together. You do what I have already done. In order for you to be encouraged this week like I have already been encouraged, we're going to have to think. I can still see this when my brother played ball. There was a card that was on the door of his bedroom. And there was a ball, glove, and a bat, an old beagle hound with a cap on maybe. I can just see that. And this is what it said. When I works hard. When I plays hard. When I think, I fall asleep. Don't fall asleep when we're thinking this morning. Let's think. Let's think back where God has personally, as did with Paul, placed certain individuals in your life, in your past, that when you needed it the most, were there to encourage you. Will you do that for me this morning? Let me just share a couple things if I can. I'll call your attention to where we was at last week in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 4 and 5. And this is what Paul said concerning Timothy. Notice what he says, greatly desire to see you, being mindful of your tears, that I might be filled with joy when I'll call to remembrance the unfinished faith that was in thee, that first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice. And I am persuaded that it's also in you. Now notice, Paul said, I'm encouraged when I think about your grandmother and your mother, Timothy. I can only imagine how you feel when you think about them. Now, I was very fortunate. I was born in 52. My father was saved after I was born, but before I realized that I was even born. You figure that one out. So I never knew not to have a mom or a dad that didn't go to church. My mother was a child of an Assembly of God preacher, John Markin. And to read the history about him, he was the kind that went around and to listen to my mom. They would get in a car and travel for hours, and they'd go to the old brush arbor meetings, and he'd hold those type of meetings. And that's how they were raised up. My dad, not so. My dad's father left him and his mama when he was in the 4th grade. He had a twin brother, a baby brother, and an older sister. Now, let's just figure this out. This is in the late 20s prior to the Depression. And you sit right there and you leave those type of children. And my grandmother never remarried. She raised that family entirely all by herself. With the grace of God. An old Methodist woman as she was. He didn't have all those happy times growing up that maybe some of us have had. And yet by the grace of God, two individuals' paths crossed. One thing led to another, and a Christian home was developed. And so I had the opportunity of being raised up in a Christian home. So I can think about those things. I can think about those things. I can think about certain individuals in that one particular church that I went to in my entire life. It's not there anymore, but my entire life went to this one particular Baptist church. And all those individuals that had an impact in my life. I'll name two just real quick, and I know Gary's going to remember them. Don't ask me why we call them Aunt. They wasn't related to me. Remember Aunt Tiny Reynolds and Aunt Daisy Williams? Now, I don't have a clue why they were Aunt. Remember Pauline Valentine? She was a member here. It's amazing how you can remember just certain people that were, and this is what I remember about folks. And I can go on and on and on. Name, I can talk about Don Gene Priest. I can talk about Marvin Jolly and Eileen Jolly. I talk about a lot of folks. But what I remember is this. These folks were faithful. I remember that. And it's funny. There come times when those folks taught Sunday school and church training classes that we happened to be in. And I'm going to be honest. Hey, I wasn't the best of a student for you to teach. And I don't even know why I did it, Gary, but your mother was teaching what we call the intermediate class. And there, we had the windows there. I just decided to climb out that window during training class. I'll tell you what was done. Your mama told my daddy. Now, I'm not going to the rest of the story, but folks that just were strong enough to give us words of encouragement when we needed it the most. And then in 72, just a minute. 72 when we got married. I was checking that one out. I can still remember that house that my better half and I rented for probably about a year before we bought a house there in Paragould. And it was all the comforts of home. You had a living room, you had a bedroom, and you had a bathroom, and you had a kitchen about the size of this pulpit. And I remember two people coming knocking on the door of that house. And I remember their names. Bob Emmons was one of them, and the other guy was Larry Spencer. Larry Spencer happened to be the pastor at Browns Chapel Baptist Church. Won't know if we'd be interested in coming out there and being their children's church pastor. And so there we find ourselves out there. Of course, where it all started. And I remember Larry and Sue Spencer being so good to us, giving us words of encouragement, because you're talking about someone that was green, that didn't know anything. But yet there were two other folks that became dear to us while we were there. And Larry and Sue, shortly while we were there, Larry and Sue, after they finished 2 years over at Southern Baptist College, answered the call, went up to a little city in Regina, Saskatchewan in Canada, and started a mission church, still there today. And we hooked up with a couple that was a little older than us, and yet not much older. And there was Francis and Laverne McClellan. And just a few years ago, our children had the opportunity to spark an ark, and you helped Laverne at a gas station of all things. But anyway, then it was on to, in 73, to Dutch Chapel Baptist Church, where I met the infamous Faye Ritchie. And did she not have an impact on my life, as she has many of your lives? Folks, are you thinking back? Are you not surrounded today with a company of witnesses? You see, I haven't even begun to scratch the surface. Two that I really want to mention is my mother-in-law and father-in-law. These were godly individuals that God put in my life. Well, maybe not so much my mother-in-law. No, I'm just joking. She had to learn me, because she didn't joke and cut up. She had to learn me. Nancy's dad was a cut up from day one. Now, he wouldn't tell it. He probably wouldn't admit that, but he did like to joke and cut up. But in each church and where you went, you got people that were full of encouragement. Full of encouragement. Can you think of somebody? You see, Maybe you didn't have the opportunity to be brought up in a Christian home. Well, don't let that ruin it for you, your children or grandchildren. Let them see the influence that you could have on their life. Just because you may not have had that influence. Or maybe you did have that type of Christian influence earlier. Shouldn't that give you the desire to pass that type of influence on to others? Let's skip on down to verse number 12, verse number 1 of chapter 12 again. Let's just start let's end where we started. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. Think about that. What is a witness? A witness is someone that saw something. Not hearsay, firsthand. Someone that was there, that was willing to stand up and testify. This church history has a great cloud of witnesses, as many churches do. That because of their faithfulness, we have been given the opportunity. Now, just because we have been given the opportunity to worship doesn't mean that our children and grandchildren will be guaranteed to have that opportunity. The Scripture teaches us to work while it is yet day, because we don't know when the night's coming. But what happens? What would happen if it got tough? If it got difficult? If someone turned the heat up a little bit and made it a little harder for us to be more open and vocal about our love for the Lord? How quickly would some crawl back in the shell, not willing to say anything because we don't want to offend anyone? And yet, think about this. There's a time in your life when this loving and caring God that you knew all of a sudden become very offensive to you. And just almost mean to you when he told you that you was lost and on your way to hell. But he didn't stop there. He shared the message of hope. Someone in our past had those words of encouragement and told us that Jesus loved me. This I know, for the Bible tells me so. Someone took time out of their schedule and shared that with us. And it had such a deep impact that it affected our eternity. Can you imagine that? Something that is so powerful that it affects one's eternity. Not just while we're here or for a year or whatever, but an entire lifetime, eternity. Hey, what a witness that must be. And he says that we need to share in the excitement we're compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. Hey, did you think of any at all? Someone that has already gone on to be with the Lord. And you might miss them tremendously, and yet if it weren't for them, you might not be where you are today. Maybe that individual may be even alive today. When's the last time we have thanked them for the words of encouragement? And when's the last time you and I have given anyone some words of encouragement? As I read over and over and over again, chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews, I could see Paul as he was trying to put himself right there in the shoes of the people that he's writing to. He's writing to Jews that have been saved. Many of them have been abused by their families. The Jewish families have cut them off. We don't have anything to do with you if you're going to be a Christian. So some of their families have disowned them. Some of them had lost everything they had because they began to take a stand for Jesus' sake. And in the Roman Empire, that was a no-no because Caesar was Lord, not Jesus. These folks had suffered. And all Paul was trying to do was to encourage them and showing them what God had done. In the Old Testament, God was faithful. In the New Testament, God was faithful. And let me share this. If He is faithful in the Old Testament, if He is faithful in the New Testament, He's faithful to each and every generation that comes and goes. Those are words of encouragement. God says, I change not. Listen. What word of encouragement do you need today? Now, I can look at this sanctuary and see a lot of faces missing, knowing where some are at. Also knowing some has been gone for a long time. And I can become very discouraged. Or I can look at it a little differently and turn an empty pew not into a discouragement, but into an opportunity. How are we going to look at it? When we come and we're disappointed with perhaps the crowd not being like we want it to be. That's understandable. How can we be an encourager to that person next to us or in front of us, or the one that we're going to encounter tomorrow? Wherefore, seeing. Now that's an important word in this verse of Scripture. What do you see today? In this sanctuary, what do you see? What has God allowed you to see? Seeing we are compassed about, we are surrounded with so great a cloud. When the storms come, what do people do? They watch the clouds. I can still remember this. When we lived just this side of Aunt Betty Ditch and right down there, just right across from Cully's Woods, there was an old storm cellar that a lot of folks had spent a lot of time in that old storm cellar. We didn't have no street lights going down that road. There was no lights anywhere. There wasn't that forecast. There wasn't that radar, but you had people out there looking and watching the horizon. And lo and behold, here would come a neighbor, or here would come a neighbor. And people would go down and spend some time in that storm cellar because they were watching the clouds. Hey, we're surrounded with a cloud of witnesses. Can you see that cloud? And when you look at that cloud, if you'll stop, that cloud is made up of individual faces. You may have had you may have an encourager in your past that I've never met. I may have an encourager of my past that you've never met. And yet God has saw fit to put that encourager right there at the right particular time to help me. And even when I'm going, as David said in Psalms 23, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. How did he know that? Because of the witnesses. And lo and behold, hundreds of years later, Paul points out and says, I'm going to use David as a witness. And yet David in his life had witnesses. Let me challenge you today. We find ourselves leaving the messages of words of encouragement. Moving on, and it's unreal that next week is the first, we'll get into April. And Friend Day is right around the corner. Got some things going to be coming at you in a week or so about Friend Day. I encourage you to encourage each other about Friend Day. Or about any day. Hebrews 10:25. And not forsaking the assembling of ourselves, and manner such is, but exhorting one another, and the much more as you see that day approaching. Being excited about coming to church. Well, it gets boring. Really. Being excited about coming to church. This is what generates the excitement. Why am I coming? That old hymn that we sang years ago, Brethren, we have met to worship and adore the love our God. Will you pray with all your power while we try to preach His word? Listen, while we come. Why do those people in your past, heads bowed, eyes closed, why are those people